Welcome to Magnify Our Impact. And today I'm very privileged to speak to a great friend of mine who is really inspiring in South Africa. And me and him met last year, and he's created an incredible organization through his legacy, through his family, to help tens of thousands of children in South Africa, but also, is very, very close-knit with regards to how they move forward as a nation, and advise the government at a very senior level with regards to education and how to look after the kids. So it's a real privilege to have Marc here with me. And I know that when I first met Marc, we went for dinner, and as you do, I said, tell me about your life, and he said, tell me about yours. So we swapped stories, and I could not believe the coincidences that have happened in our lives in South Africa over the last 60 or 70 years with our family. And so it's such a small world. And I was just very privileged to be able to meet Marc. And unfortunately, during this interview, I know this man will be far too humble. So he kind of dulls down everything he achieves. I know he does. So if anything Marc says to us today, if you triple it, then you get closer to the truth. But Marc, thank you so much for being here. And I think it would be wonderful if you could just to give us an idea for a couple of minutes of where you come from, your background, your amazing journey, and where you are today.
Craig, first and foremost, thank you very much indeed. I am actually very humble to be interviewed by you or selected by you, because I don't really see what I'm doing that materially different to what so many thousands are doing. So my time commitment, my energy commitment is no greater or less or more important than the input that so many others are doing. And listening to you give me that introduction, clearly I'm going to go and do my DNA analysis and determine whether we want family, because it's only family who can give me an introduction like that. Very quickly, briefly, my background was that born in Zimbabwe, came to South Africa as a youngster, attended my high schooling here and went to university here, did an undergraduate degree in business. But from a very young age, my family were very involved with community. My late grandfather, who started life as a pauper, quite frankly, and built an international business that my father and his brother then grew globally, always had a philosophy about respecting people. And what was key critical in respecting people was that you necessarily didn't treat people as victims. From a very early age, I realized my grandfather, whilst very generous in helping people in business, would lend them money, and in his own mind, he probably wrote it off, but he made it a loan rather than necessarily a grant, because he felt that a man's standing and stature needed to be kept intact. And I know a number of people came to me and said, I owed your grandfather money over 20 years. The fact that they kept paying back maybe a small pittance against the loan kept at least their dignity intact. So it was a very important lesson learnt at a relatively early age, that philanthropy, critically important, and we were always involved with, for argument's sake, dealing with people who were living with, say, disabilities, who could never pay back a loan, all the way through to the spectrum of people who needed money, credit, so that they could, in fact, continue to run their business. After having completed my undergraduate degree, my commerce degree, I went into business and spent a number of years with my family group globally, effectively chasing bottom line profits, but at the same time always very conscious of an engagement in the world of philanthropy. Holidays were often spent with a child that my parents would take out of the orphanage to take on holiday with us. So it wasn't uncommon. And philanthropy didn't feel like something you did in your left pocket whilst you put, profits into your right pocket. The two are sort of naturally combined. During my career, I experienced running a business that was in the field of private equity. It was the first listed company in South Africa to finance Black economic empowerment transactions. And the relevance of that, I'll be very brief, came to light as I took on the mantle of CEO of that organization after I had had to leave South Africa during the struggle years because of my engagement in the struggle against apartheid. I'd had some incidences with the security police, and my sister and I were on a list, a wanted list, and my sister, in fact, left to go and join the ANC offices in London, and I left to America. And during that period of time, I did my MBA at Kellogg Grad School, but I always felt this huge tug to come back to South Africa. I spent some years in the United States, and when Mandela was released, I determined it was time for me to come back to South Africa, which is when I came back and then took this role of running a Black economically empowered private equity business. And Craig, what bothered me terribly was to see the enrichment that was going on. There were a handful of Black individuals who were in the right place at the right time and created enormous wealth for themselves. Simply because there was this changeover process going on in South Africa. But I didn't see that filtering through to the large masses in South Africa. It was during that period of time that I was approached, in fact, by Mandela to start an initiative called the SMILE Foundation, helping one young child who had a facial deformity. Tando Malambo Manyati was her name. And she had the Moebius syndrome condition, which is a facial paralysis. And the skill base didn't exist in the country to be able to perform the operation, the required operation, which is quite a complex procedure. So 20 years ago, I flew across, met with various surgeons in the United States, put a team together, funded their trip to South Africa. And whilst they were here, I determined rather than going into the private sector, we should go to the public sector and teach the skill to doctors in the public sector. And effectively, that was the start of what's now become the SMILE Foundation, which has been operating for 20 odd years, operating anywhere between 400 to 600 children with various different forms of facial deformities, typically children that come from disadvantaged backgrounds, can't afford private healthcare, come to the state hospital, and we kind of use our leverage there to orchestrate SMILE weeks where children get operated on, do a lot more these days in the sense of also skills training of doctors. We buy equipment. More recently, we've started building pediatric burns units because these hospitals are hopelessly under-resourced. So we've tried to actually integrate what we try to do as part and parcel of the hospital rather than be an outside interventionist coming into the hospital. And I'm pleased to say that model's worked exceptionally well. After running that private equity business and having started SMILE Foundation, my father, who's now deceased, had started a charity initiative offering various supports to township-based residents. I think he was one of these guys who, during apartheid years, what's not often known is that most white individuals really didn't know what was going on in the townships, or whether they were naive or chose not to know is another debate. But my father was horrified because with the collapse of apartheid, he was able for the first time to drive into these environments and see just how impoverished people were and how bare the resources were. So I think almost as a knee-jerk reaction, he and the then chief rabbi of the country decided they had to do something. So they started a series of ad hoc projects all around the country. A feeding initiative in one area, agricultural area, developing shacks for elderly people in another township area. And that organization operated for the best part of about 10 years until my father actually had heart troubles and approached me to ask whether I wouldn't consider joining this organization, Afrika Tikkun, as its CEO. We had some interesting debates at the board because I was not prepared to give up my role with SMILE Foundation, which was my baby. And finally, I think the board of Afrika Tikkun acceded to the fact that I wasn't going to give up SMILE Foundation and that I could still perform a role with Chinese walls between the two. Albeit I'd look to try and see how do I integrate the two organizations. And we've done that quite successfully in a way, although they're still running separate entities. So Afrika Tikkun, really what happened when I got here, I found these, as I say, ad hoc initiatives, well run. My dad was a pretty disciplined businessman. He'd run a public company. The family business had grown internationally into what is now the Belron Group, car glass, auto glass, trading around the world, Safe Light in the United States. So there was a strong culture of business that permeated our family DNA. And that then found its way into the way my dad had set up Afrika Tikkun. The problem, unfortunately, though, was that Afrika Tikkun, in my opinion, was not built around a sustainable model. No disrespect meant to our founders. It was really driven by this enormous passion of a man to do good and change the circumstances. And as I say, I think there was an element of guilt. He built up his business in an apartheid South Africa. So there was this need to, I think, do more than just necessarily give back. There was this need to actually transform. And that, therefore, was the meaning of the word tikkun, to transform in a positive way. And my input 15 years ago was to say, we have to create a model that is long-term sustainable and not dependent upon any one individual. So what would the outcome be? And I started to look at my own kids. And I said, my kids had been through a situation where family members had passed, young family members had passed, as they dealt with death. They had their own challenges through my unfortunate divorce. So they had to cope with that. But they were still well-rounded kids at the end of it, capable of functioning in society. And then when I looked at the township kids, I found kids who had this passion to advance themselves. I believe that because of, smartphones, cell phones, Facebook, your average township kid does not want to be on social security grants. The average township kid wants a job, wants a profile that they can say they're doing something productive with their lives. So I recognized that was an asset. And if we could harness that asset, what we could necessarily, because these weren't people looking for handouts. I wasn't going to have to look at a charity that was going to look after victims. I was looking after people who really wanted to aspire to something, which is incredibly inspiring.
Yes.
So I decided I'd get involved in this organization, Afrika Tikkun, bring in some of the professional business skills or attributes that hopefully I'd learned through my years in business and business school. And I only anticipated being here for a couple of years. But I fell in love with this enthusiasm of township youth. And so we created a model called Cradle to Career. Because again, I looked back at what were my kids, my own children's developmental years. And I realized there needed to be early childhood development. And then graduating from early childhood development, we had to provide a support service for kids who are going to rather crappy schools, necessarily needed to come to an environment after school, which could help shape them, motivate them, most importantly, make them believe in themselves, and then help graduate them to the point where they could start to look at their own career opportunities. So we, in fact, then started to develop a career element, a career building phase to that developmental process. So today, Afrika Tikkun operates in 6 centers across, township centers across South Africa. Our reach is approximately about 20,000 children aged anywhere from 2 years to 22 years of age, roughly. We build preschools, we build youth development centers, we build career development centers, and those are all run under what we call Afrika Tikkun non-for-profit charity. And the staff that run those are all from the local community. But sorry, it doesn't just end there, because that's only half the equation. And I'm afraid is a criticism that I have of a lot of organizations. They go so far, but then they miss the crucial step of taking a young individual and introducing them into the world of work. There's a huge, huge physical and social distance, a gap that exists between the township environments and where the workplaces are. Because township economies have not necessarily developed sufficient to create real employment. So what we did is we set up a separate business unit that would go to the corporates and ask them what skills did they need? Where were they? What was their long-term business strategies? And if we could determine what skills they were going to require, well, we knew we had developed the values from early on in these kids. We knew we had developed individuals who believed in themselves. Now it was a matter of giving them the competencies and skills that would match to the job market. So we started to develop an organization, Afrika Tikkun Services, which runs training, learnerships, work experience programs, and then ultimately looks at placements. To finance all of that, though, we necessarily had to look at additional forms of revenue, because as the organization was growing, as you can appreciate, to just simply rely on charity contributions, CSI monies from corporates, was dangerous, particularly once we started reaching the 100 million rand mark. So we created a private equity business, going back to my story I told you about being involved in a listed company. And we then used that entity to start buying stakes in companies, using the dividends to help fund the charity, and equally using our stakes on the board of those companies to motivate them to employ from this pool that we had developed over the years.
It's amazing. So, wow, that's a heck of an inspirational story. And there's a lot behind that, a huge amount, Marc. And so my question with that is, you come from an amazing background where your grandfather started from nothing, in inverted commas, but obviously had a lot within him and a huge drive, and your father too, and now you. So just give me an idea of what internally drives you, Marc, to create this massive change. You're now working with over 20,000 children in these environments. You're setting up all sorts of different centers. You're helping them with enormous different opportunities with regards to business once they go through your entire program. You're trying to make an environment that many people have not been able to in the past sustainable for the kids. So internally, talk about your values and your belief systems. When things get tough, what do you tell yourself to keep going? Where does this inspiration in you come from?
Craig, I think that, I got raised, as I say, in an environment where my grandfather, my father, my uncle were all absolute work junkies. I remember an experience where when I was working in our family business, I used to get in early. I used to get in at about 6:45 in the morning. And my grandfather would arrive at about 7. The workday was only supposed to start at 8. And he saw me reading the newspaper one morning when he walked through the stores where I was based. And he said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm reading the newspaper." He says, "It's 7 o'clock, not on my time. You read the newspaper when you go home, not on my time," kind of attitude. So I had that work ethic drummed into me. Sadly, in a number of ways, a lot of the relationship that I shared with my dad was built around work discussion and debate. So, we would often couch personal issues in sort of work terms. When we used to meet, we used to have sort of formal meetings on personal issues. So there was a work ethic right from the very beginning. What drives me, though, particularly now in these times, when COVID is so rampant and affecting our lives, and we've turned our whole organization into a provider of essential services.
Yes.
Fed over 50,000 families with food parcels, a monthly food parcel, masks, sanitizers. We've set up mobile clinics. What drives me is a sense of actual purpose. When I was in the financial world, and I was blessed, we had some very, good successes. I, at one stage, had secured the Sega TV game agency and brought them here to South Africa. Built that business up, sold that. The private equity business, when we privatized it ultimately, we made good money on that. There was a gap inside of me. I can't explain it to you. It was like a unresolved issue, and materialism wasn't going to be sufficient to satisfy that. Maybe it was because my family business had grown to this mammoth international group that nothing I did was really going to build a business of equal size. So it was no point comparing my personal value set with that of the companies. Maybe that was it. But I just felt that when I started my SMILE Foundation, I started finding that I started to enjoy the dividend of seeing people's lives change. It meant far more to me than necessarily the amount of money I was able to put into my pocket. And again, I think I'm blessed in the sense that, making this shift into full-time work in this, it's called a community upliftment field, I realized I didn't need as much anymore. The motor car I bought, I kept for 5, 6, 7 years. It didn't matter to me. Kind of story. You have to change it every 2 years. That type of stuff.
And with that then, Marc, is obviously there's two things. There's the environment that shapes us and our genetics that shape us. And I guess, you were brought up with this amazing work ethic that obviously always has challenges around it, but nevertheless, taught you so much. What do you, when things get tough, because there's a lot of people watching this interview, Marc, that are looking to grow and develop their charities and grow and develop their organizations in a way that you guys have been so successful in doing. So talk to us a little bit more about your values and your psychology of when things get difficult. What do you say to yourself? What's very important if you were to give advice to somebody who's got a small team that's looking to magnify their impact? What do you think are the few things that are most important these guys do to be able to scale in a way that you guys have?
Craig, I'll come back to the word that I used earlier on, purpose. I think that the greatest gift that I've had moving into this particular field, never mind the joy that you get from seeing other human beings' lives change materially, is working in this space, and I work harder in this space than I've ever worked, certainly in the commercial world, is you have to reflect inside. And no matter how big an organization you're running or how small an organization you're running, the ability to take that introspection, that inner journey, which, our tools, our sensory tools, touch, taste, feel, whatever, we're totally ill-equipped to use those tools to introspect inside. You've almost got to find a consciousness inside of yourself. And in finding that consciousness, you find a sense of comfort in terms of who you are and what your purpose is. And I mean, my gosh, in this field, you're constantly faced with challenges on a daily basis. People that are dying, for argument's sake, from HIV/AIDS. We had, huge numbers of staff, unfortunately, contracted HIV/AIDS, and many passed away. We had at one stage to deal with a massive retrenchment when we had the crash of the 80s, and our donors didn't come through to us. And I looked inside myself and I said, what is my real purpose? Why do I do what I'm doing? And you get the answer very quickly. And that gives you that ability to find that resolve to carry on despite the issues. And again, there's maybe a spiritual belief that when you are doing what you're supposed to be doing for what your creator put you on this planet to do, you kind of have a sense of knowing that things are going to be okay.
Yes.
Ultimately, they will work out. And you learn almost to go with the flow. I found when I was in the commercial world, particularly towards the latter part, and I'm still in the commercial world, my family portfolio, still requires management, and I'm still engaged in that. But I just found that when I was involved in the business of making money, particularly in that private equity, listed private equity company, and you had to fight. You used to talk about win-win scenarios, but honestly, that was bullshit. Really and truly, the reality of it was you used to compare your balance sheet against your competitor's balance sheet and determining, how much more successful you were than everybody else. So you were always looking at this, I want to win kind of, not at all costs, but I want to win. And now when you get into this particular field, you realize that that what you really are doing is you're a catalyst. You get into a mindset of being of service to others, and therefore it's not about you at all. Your fixation shifts, your focus shifts. While it's still very internally focused,
yes,
your focus shifts away from your own personal ego, I believe, to the outcomes that you want to be able to achieve through your energies and your own efforts, and available to everybody. It doesn't depend on the size of your balance sheet.
No.
It doesn't depend on, frankly speaking, whether you're able-bodied or disabled, because God gives us all the gift of choice. And if we take the time to look inside ourselves to try and determine what our purpose on this earth is, then and operate within that, choose to operate within that choice, use that choice to operate within that purpose, then I think we somehow find a flow. We find a flow to life. And
so can you, I'm completely from the same school, and to introspect and to find my intention, my purpose, to as a foundation of this work, as you say, to look at our beliefs and our values and to create, then to really get clarity as to what we're on this planet for. Can you give us some kind of an idea, Marc, if people are looking to internalize and they've never been conscious of this before, or some of us grow up and we just take one job to the next. We don't necessarily look at purpose in this way. If people want to look deeper and create that flow, is there a practical process that you go through every day to be able to get clarity as to what's my purpose when there's a war zone around me, or I'm in the middle of coronavirus or whatever? What are the practical steps that leaders can make and take to be able to get clarity as to their purpose?
I'd like to answer that in a twofold way. One, I'd like to tell you what not to do, based on, as I say, mistakes that I make. Problem in this kind of field is you get emotionally very attached and very involved. We have a terminology called responsible kindness, which I'll chat to you about in a second as the solution to this. But, you know, in this desire to be good and this desire to be kind, you can become so overwhelmed because there's never enough. You can never do enough, quite frankly, that what ends up happening is you often lose sight of sometimes the priorities. So the one thing you shouldn't necessarily do is become so entrapped, as I did, for argument's sake, even now after 15 years in this space, working in this space full time, when coronavirus hit here. Oh my God, how are we going to feed our kids? How are we going to feed their families? How are we going to make sure that the elderly amongst those are in fact isolated and protected? And each night I used to go to bed with my head full of more and more challenges, driven by a huge sense of fear, not for myself, but fear for the communities. And that became overwhelming, quite frankly, until I realized that I had introduced a concept called responsible kindness. And what responsible kindness is, it's a double-barreled value in the sense that it says, yes, you must be kind, but equally you have to be responsible. How do you ensure that you don't create more victim mentality, more dependency? How do we find solutions? So yes, all well and good. We delivered 50,000 families food parcels for the month, but we can't, it'd be irresponsible for us to have created the expectation that that would be something we would do on an ongoing basis.
No, of course.
So, but that was my immediate reaction. I became overwhelmed with that. And we started working, as I say, 15-hour, 16-hour days to organize and orchestrate all of that. Along the way, I realized very quickly what we have to do to find a longer-term solution is to start introducing things like a pack of seeds with growing instructions. We had to be sensitive to the areas geographically where we handed out the different seeds and said to people, you can in fact grow your own vegetables, which will provide you with the following source of nutrients.
Yes.
And therefore, our feeding scheme now will orient toward providing the staples that are not provided through being able, through a home growing program. So in response to your question, I would say, be responsible, be kind, first and foremost, but then ask a lot of the very difficult questions about, are you being responsible? Are you creating dependency? Or are you empowering? How are you acting towards your fellow? You know, I have a philosophy amongst my own staff. We all should help one another out. But if we find we're helping, you know, a fellow colleague out indefinitely, there gets to be a point where that particular individual's role needs to be questioned to determine are they contributing or are they in fact draining from the solution.
Yes, absolutely. And so but that's just struck in me so hard that that's very interesting that you know, don't create dependency, create empowerment, and that balance is vital, isn't it? That's vitally important. Marc, you've two more questions here that I think you know, I'm really excited about your answers with, because to me this is the hub of so much. I think we learn through experiences, and so my next question is, what do you think are the 2 or 3 experiences in your life? It's going to be hard for you to pick these, but what do you think the 2 or 3 experiences that you've had in your life that have shaped you and inspired you the most to be creating this impact? And what were the learnings of those experiences?
Reflecting on those, I think one goes way back to my school years, where sort of at the age of 15, I was selected to play for the first team rugby. Why was that so important for me? Because it had huge ego appeal. All of a sudden, you know, I was this, you know, youngster playing in with the big boys. And the lesson that I also learned was that from that, the first match that I played, I'll never forget having been taken off on a stretcher 15 minutes into the game, and it was a curtain raiser. It was the early curtain raisers for the Lions tour to South Africa. And I was concussed, knocked out in the first 10 minutes of the game kind of situation. And our team lost dismally. And I got a real berating from our coach. And it made me realize just how dangerous, in fact, one's ego can necessarily be. Because I ran onto that pitch thinking, you know, I was just absolutely fantastic. In truth, I didn't realize I had to play within the team. The second experience, I think that had a huge impact, really did in fact change me materially, was when I started the SMILE Foundation and was called by Mandela. It was a mistake. Mandela was actually looking for my father, and the phone call came through fortuitously to me whilst my father was overseas. And Mandela asked if I would assist to get this young child operated on. And I recall having this extraordinary experience of working with Mandela, not as my president, as he was of the country, but of my co-collaborator. We used to sit in his lounge at home and we used to talk about, and I used to present a dream. He used to dream about, on a macro level, what he would like to see for children of South Africa. I, on a micro level, try to translate that dream into what would the opportunities be for children who were living from disadvantaged, impoverished townships, being able to access surgery, which previously under apartheid South Africa, elective surgery, was denied to them. So it was this incredible experience of understanding from a man who would not allow obstacles to stand in the way. And every time I used to come to him and say to him, Madiba, I have this problem, or I've got that problem, in 2 minutes, he would apply a mindset that said, let's look at how we positively address this rather than let's look at it from a negative perspective.
Yes.
Who do we need to co-opt? Who can benefit from this? So he would do things like he would phone up the CEO of South African Airways when I needed airline tickets to bring the American surgeons to South Africa. And he would say to them, you know, I, Mandela, will put a news clip out saying what a wonderful job South African Airways does for the disadvantaged in South Africa. Fantastic. I hadn't even thought about that as a solution. So he taught me that you can look at a problem from either the negative and see only barriers, or you can see the solution and then re-engineer backwards.
You've already mentioned a number of elements there. But, talk to me more about working with Nelson Mandela so closely. There's probably a plethora of different things, but one of the greatest national and macro leaders of definitely the last century on our planet. What were the biggest things that you learned from your friendship and working so closely with Nelson Mandela?
Humility. He had an unbelievable ability, no matter who he was with, to engage. It's a mark of a lot of great men. I've come across Gary Player, another sort of character very much like that. When you're in his company, he looks at you, he engages with you, and you have his attention exclusively. Might only be for a minute or two, but you have it. He's not one of these individuals who, whilst he's talking to you, is engaged in thousands of other things. He has this ability to focus his mind on the issue that is present there and then. My late dad was very much like that as well. I mean, a man who was very, very active and very involved in thousands of activities. But when you're in his company, or when a problem was presented or an issue was presented, it didn't need to be necessarily a problem, a joy, total focus. So you felt like you had appropriate time with him, even if the time was only relatively, short. So I think that was very, very important. So I learned a huge amount about the humility of giving people time and focus. The other thing, as I said, that I learned about him is that he always came at issues with a vision as to what it would look like when it was fixed, and re-engineered backwards.
Yes.
He didn't suffer fools, by the way. He was quick-tongued, with people who necessarily would want to be there to waste his time or, wax lyrical and stuff like that. So I equally learned that for a man who was such a phenomenal statesman, that he was able to, in fact, divide his time up and prioritize. So time spent with him was never, ever, although I'll say this to you, I used to take my daughter at times with me to his home, and he on one occasion turned around, called his secretary, got a pad and a pen, and my daughter, I think, was 12 years of age at the time, and he said, young girl, I would like you to please take minutes of our meeting, because there should never be any one person who ever does nothing, sits on their backsides and does nothing. So even a 12-year-old, he made sure went to work, and he actually wrote her a note saying, I have great confidence that you will become one of South Africa's future leaders. So he was hugely inspirational, hugely.
Yes.
I mean, the fact that he has a man, he's the president of the country with a huge agenda, and that he could think to take time out to scribble on a piece of paper, a note like that, I can tell you it's affected my daughter's life as it affected mine.
Of course.
An impact that she will now have equally, I think, on thousands of others, hopefully.
Yes. And so, I've always learned, I've learned from the last 15 years that who we spend our time with is who we become.
Yeah, very true.
And so, you've talked about his humility and his presence and his ability to be able, even if it's a couple of minutes, for you to know that when you're with him and he's looking at you, you're the only person that matters right now. And, those are my words. I hope I'm, sharing back to you the truth there. And also his ability to be able to take time for an individual when having such a macro focus. And the fourth thing that really struck me about what you've said is, I've never heard in this way before, Marc, is to not only go to the end, which I love to do, go to the end of a project, your life, and look back, but also to see it as fixed. To have the vision, the ability to go to the end and say, not only is this our vision, but what does it feel like now that it's fixed, and what have we created here? And, that's inspirational. That's empowering.
It really is. And I think that's what's, frankly, from a South African perspective, that's where we lost our way. We, over this last decade, certainly, we had a Mandela who talked about a rainbow nation. Yes. And in everybody's mind, the picture of what a rainbow nation looked like differed. But in principle, the values of a rainbow nation were effectively aligned. Yes. And I think it's incredibly powerful, especially for leaders of any NGO or a non-for-profit philanthropic initiative, is to try and paint that picture as to what does it look like when people are fixed, when situation is fixed, when thousands of starving people have got access to food, for argument's sake, when unemployed or employed. And if you can create that picture in people's minds, they will interpret it differently, but that doesn't matter. Mandela never spelled out what the rainbow nation would necessarily look like. He put in colors, as it were, and he would give wonderful quotes as to what a rainbow nation might feel like. But he never ever prescribed. He never went and wrote a whole charter. Yes, we had a constitution, which was really, I think, rather revolutionary in the world, really enlightening. But that wasn't Mandela who put that together. Mandela didn't define the constitution that now drives the values of our country. He just simply planted the seed of what it would look like when it was fixed. And then a whole bunch of people worked to make that happen. Unfortunately, when you get leaders that then come to the fore without that vision, necessarily what happens is, the country gets pulled apart.
I wanted to ask you one more question, if I may, which is,
please,
with everything that you've talked about today, what and it seems to me that it's gone, in 40 minutes, there's been so much wealth here that, I feel that we just started to talk, but what is the number one most important piece of advice that you would give to a young leader or somebody just coming into an organization that wants to magnify their impact and go from where they are to really make change, bigger than they have done before, what's the number one most important thing, or a couple of things that you think are of primary importance that they need to focus on each and every day?
Well, I think if you're the leader of the organization, you've invariably become the leader.
Or the leader of a project, indeed.
Or
a leader
even leader of a project. You are, in fact, empowered to give effect to your vision, right? The fact that you're in that leadership role means that you are already empowered to give effect to that vision. Now the challenge is to listen, because you can't do it on your own. There is no way. I don't care whether it's running a vegetable garden or whether it's running, a really sizable group spread across South Africa. It's looking after 20,000 kids on a daily basis. The reality of it is you have to take people along with you. You've got to necessarily get people to buy into your vision. So there's a certain amount of selling that you're doing all the time. But the best way to sell is once you've painted, as it were, Mandela style, the Rainbow Nation picture, sit back and listen to other human beings and truly listen. Give them the sense that they've been heard. Engage with them. So often I've learned that if I'm in a meeting with somebody, to effectively put my cell phone on silent, even if it's only for the first 15 minutes, or if I've got a really important call coming through that's going to disturb the meeting, to make an apology and tell individuals why I'm taking that call, not just presume that they should accept, so that they feel important and they feel that their views are being heard. If you're going to build a team, you have to listen before you necessarily talk yourself. The second thing is to live by example. You have to lead by example. People don't do what you say, they do what you do. They practice what you necessarily yourself do, and how you act. That says so much more necessarily. During this COVID period of time, I asked workers to sort of get together and pack food parcels and take them out into the field. I got hazmat suits and stuff like this. But until I actually put on one of those suits and I got into the back of the buckies and went into these areas and worked alongside, and I didn't have to do it every day, but I certainly needed to do it enough times, not just ceremonially, but I had to do it enough times.
Get stuck in. And
I had to see for myself, because this was all new for us all, delivering 50,000 food parcels into communities where the demand was for 5 million people wanting those food parcels. There were some hairy moments, where we had mobs coming out and rocking our cars and stuff like this, and demanding that we provide more food than we necessarily had access to, that kind of stuff. Until you've experienced that, you can't really make a lot of the calls. And at the same time, again, I don't think you need to necessarily become such an activist that you've got to be leading that way all the time. But I do think that you need to at least show your staff that you are prepared to, understand. And again, it goes back to my upbringing in my family business. Despite the fact that I had fancy degrees, I'll never forget my grandfather when I came back from a very successful trip to the UK, having been there for 6 months, launching one of our ranges of products. My prize was an overall and a job going out learning how to become a glazier out in one of the sort of more rural areas, because there was that philosophy that unless you've experienced it, and I don't think my grandfather anticipated that I would be a glazier for years. He certainly wanted me to get my glazing ticket, so that by the time I elevated into the organization and was managing glaziers, I at least had some sense of what it was that these individuals experienced. So I do think that that's important. Management by walking around, critically important. It's so easy to get stuck in an office, particularly with technology today. I just think it is critically important that management requires there to be a presence. Again, going back to Mandela lesson, be present, be involved, be seen, be active, without necessarily having to do that each day and every day, because you can overdo it as well on that basis. So I think learn to listen and lead by example.
That's so valuable. Marc, thank you so much for your time today.
Not at all. Thank you so much.
Great talking to you. Thank you so much.
I'm very, very grateful to you, especially, coming from you with the experiences that you've had globally, having made the sacrificing some of the luxuries that you have to go and work in some of the places that you have, having set up some of the initiatives so far from home for you that you have that are still functioning so well today. A lot of the leadership questions you asked me, I know that you yourself could answer well enough. So I'm honored that somebody of your ilk would want to even, talk to me today.
Bless you. Thank you so much, Marc,
and I'm very
for your
grateful
wisdom and your guidance. Thank you so much.